The Supreme Court has decided to hear two cases pertaining to the Trump administration's handling of immigration in the United States. The first is a challenge to the Trump administration's use of Pentagon money to build the southern border wall. The other will focus on the administration's policy on asylum applicants. Back in June, a federal appeals court ruled that the government's use of $2.5 billion in Pentagon funding was improperly diverted by the administration to build more than 100 miles of border wall. The court ruled that only Congress can approve of such a transfer of funds. The court will also hear the administration's appeal of a lower court ruling on its Remain in Mexico policy of returning asylum seekers to that country while awaiting court hearings. Policy followed a surge of immigrants at the southern border from Central and South America. The Supreme Court is expected to hear both cases early next year with a decision by the spring. Joining us now, Vice News host and MSNBC contributor Paola Ramos. She's the author of the new book entitled Finding Latinx in Search of the Voices Redefining Latino Identity. The book explores the many Latino subcultures in the U.S. that can sway the outcome of the election. Great to have you on the show, Paola.
Thank you.
Explain to us which different subsets of Latino culture could impact the election and how.
So the whole purpose of the book was kind of my lesson learned from the 2016 campaign, where I was the deputy director of Hispanic press for Hillary Clinton, right? And I remember waking up November 8th thinking that the headline that morning was going to be that Latinos were the ones that voted out Donald Trump, right? And so I took this whole trip across the country trying to look at all of these battleground states through a different lens, right? How have I, right, as the daughter of immigrants, changed from my parents, right? And so I went from California, I talked to the children of farm workers. In Arizona, there's a huge indigenous community. In Florida, I went beyond just the Cuban vote, right? I talked to Puerto Ricans, I talked to Venezuelan exiles. Mm-hmm. In the South, I talked to other huge communities of Mayans. In the Midwest, I found Latinos, right? Because we barely think of Latinos in the Midwest. And so the whole book is an exercise of lessons learned from 2016 and trying to rediscover a community that I thought I knew.
You know, it's so fascinating that I think both parties for some time have looked at Latinos as just one group, a homogenous group. And that's a terrible mistake. You can't even do that in the state of Florida. If you look, for instance, in Miami-Dade right now, the Biden team is underperforming in Miami-Dade because people that are coming up from Venezuela, people that are here from Cuba, first, second generation Cuban Americans, they have a completely different look at the situation as, say,
exactly.
Puerto Ricans in Central Florida. There's so many different subsets. Explain how both parties, Republicans and Democrats alike, have missed this central fact and how the future of American politics is really going to turn on them starting to get a better understanding of the nation's fastest growing group of Americans.
Right. To me, I think the biggest lesson is that both parties, right, for years have understood the story of someone like my father and my mother, right? Like everyone understands the immigrant narrative. And this idea that we came to this country in search of opportunities and the American dream, what we've lost track of is how people like myself, the Gen Zers and the millennials, what we did with the rights that our parents fought for, right? How we have been able to how I can live freely as a Latina, but also as a queer person. And what does that mean in states like Florida and in other battleground states, right? And so I think there's this fear of messing up, right? Of asking questions like, how have young Latinos changed? What do you guys want in the agenda? And what is the American dream now? What does that mean to you, right? And so I think there's this fundamental missing question of who are Latinos right now. And I am a Cuban American myself, right? And my experience as a Cuban American in Miami is very different from that of my grandparents, right? Who grew up around this idea of socialism and communism. And so I think there's just very basic questions that we've lost track of the evolution of who Latinos are now. If you look at the big picture, it's people that look like me, but there's also 3 million Afro-Latinos. There's over 250,000 Latinos that identify as Muslim. There's over 1 million Latinos that are indigenous. If you look at the millennial Latino generation, we are more likely than any other group to identify as queer, right? And so there's all these different hybrids, and we've been sort of walking into our identities in a very free way, and people don't really know what that looks like.
Claire McCaskill.
Yes, I'm curious. I think Joe hit on something, and that is, I think too often the political parties see the Latina vote as a monolith, that it's all about immigration policy. And so there was this taking for granted that anybody who is Latina in America is going to be for the Democrats because Donald Trump has been so awful about his language and his policies around people who are like your family, wanting to come to America for all the right reasons. So what are the issues that is eating into the Democratic success of getting these voters over? Is it the threat of socialism, or is it tax policy or cultural issues? Can you point to why you think Donald Trump is doing better with these voters than we anticipated that he would?
Right. And so Arizona is a perfect example, right? Obviously, the president is there. He knows he's not going to win the national Latino vote, but he knows he has to win enough. And what you see in a place like Arizona is that there's this sudden fascination by young Latino men that see something in Trump, right? And we all scratch our heads and we don't understand what that's about. To me, at least from what I've seen, and I just got back from Arizona last week, some immigrants, right, some Latinos do want to forget that they're immigrants, right? There is this fascination and there's this assimilation, and the closest they can get to white power, right, the closest they can get to this illusion that they are not the other, right, that they are just like Trump, some people will buy that, right? And that it goes back into this notion of we're not a monolith, right? We can also be conservative. And in Trump, they see that proximity to power, right? And so that I think is just an important element to understand of why some are driven to him, right? Why are they so aching for this assimilation? And I think it goes back to, we've been lacking that, right? We've been lacking belonging for a long time. And it goes into who is giving that to us, right? Who is saying the right words? Obviously, President Trump creates an illusion. That's not right, right? It is not true. He has not actually given us a concrete agenda that actually makes us belong in this country. But at the core of what we're aching for right now is belonging.
All right, the new book is Finding Latinx in Search of the Voices, Redefining Latino Identity. Paola Ramos, thank you so much for being on the show this morning.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.